What is going on, folks? Ted from Nerd Immersion here, and I am just all kinds of excited and jazzed to bring you this interview. There's a little bit of starstruck kind of things happening here, but I have the delight and the honor to interview both Tracy and Laura Hickman about the brand new Kickstarter that you can see below us on the screen, which is hours left to back, but is just destroying stretch goals left and right. So that is Sky Raiders of Barracks. But before we talk about that, for the people who don't know, I would love it if you two could introduce yourselves and tell everybody a little bit about what you've done in the past and has led to where we are now.
Wow. Well, thanks for having us on, Ted.
Yeah, sure.
It's great to connect with you and with all the great people that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't be here without you, actually. Yeah. I'm Tracy Hickman, and
I'm Laura Hickman.
Yes, and together we are
the Hickman sisters.
Yeah, okay.
I
For the longest time, I used to go to book signings, and people would wonder where Miss Hickman was, just because of the name.
Mm-hmm.
People always used to ask me if I'd set them up with their sister, with my sister.
Yeah, I was a little bit worried about that, actually, because people were still making that confusion after my picture was in the back of the book, and I'm not sure who they knew, but
believe me, I got a couple questions about that just in talking about this interview coming out. People very, very clearly mixing up the names. So
yeah. Well, Laura and I started actually in Dungeons and Dragons. Laura is the one who introduced me to D&D.
That's true.
Very nice.
And and it actually made her a D&D widow as soon as I figured out how amazing this game was.
He was very resistant, though, because originally my girlfriend had talked me into coming down to the theater downtown that she was directing and taking this small part that someone had dropped out of the script. And I'm like, okay. So I get there, and she had told me about this strange game they'd been playing with weird shaped dice in between rehearsals with the cast. And I got there, and she says to the guys, so did you bring your books? And instead of rehearsing, we all sat down on the stage, and they handed me a sheet and said, you're a second level wizard, roll these dice.
Awesome.
And I immediately put a bunch of monsters to sleep. Kobolds, I think.
Sure.
And I was in love.
She was so deep into this, as a matter of fact, that she forgot to pick me up from work. Thank you very much. I had to go find her at this theater.
It's a good thing it was a small town.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you started telling me about this game.
Yes.
And it was, I loved, the old SPI games,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I've been raised with Monopoly and Risk and that sort of thing. So,
me too.
yeah, well, yeah, we all both had. And I asked her, what does the board look like? And she said,
well, there isn't one. You draw
Mm-hmm.
the board.
I said, okay, fine. I said, what are the rules?
They seem kind of flexible.
Oh, God, this just sounded like the dumbest game.
And I said, there's these weird shaped dice.
But for my birthday, she bought me what we call the old Blue Basic set.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I bought it for his birthday, but I gave it to him on Halloween because I could not wait.
Just could not wait. And if you remember the Blue Basic set, it was blue because they couldn't afford like a multicolor cover.
Mm-hmm.
And they decided that more black on white just looked horrible, so they printed blue on white because that was better.
Mm-hmm.
And the dice, of course, back then were we didn't have the amazing polyhedral dice that we have today. So in the dice then came with a crayon. Mm-hmm. So that you could rub it across the numbers and put wax inside
Mm-hmm.
the numbers, so you could actually read what the numbers
terrible.
were. I've still got the D20 from that set.
Very
actually,
cool.
The edges are so worn.
I believe it.
It rolls forever.
It's just like a ball at that point.
Yeah. But that's where we got started in D&D. Laura had finally, we started buying the AD&D books, the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons books, first edition as they came out.
Monster Manual. I can remember being so excited that it was coming out.
But it was expensive.
It cost as much as a full week's worth of groceries.
Oh, wow.
For us to buy these.
Sure.
So at one point, she finally, the truth is that at one point, I actually bought the first edition of the Dungeon Master's Guide using my student loan money, which, as it turns out, was actually the best investment that money was put to.
Here we are now, right? So.
Yeah, and so, but there came a point when Laura said that if we're going to spend all this money on this game, we needed to find a way to make money at it,
to make it pay for itself.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's actually where our first dungeon designs were born.
Actually, the first one, Rahasia, I wrote because Tracy wanted someone to run a game for him. He'd been designing them all. So while he was at the theater in the evening, I sat at home and designed that dungeon.
Yeah, and designed the dungeon. So we started with absolutely no concept of copyright infringement whatsoever.
We didn't know what we were doing.
We didn't know what we were doing. So we started designing and printing, manufacturing adventures for people to play. And we did Rahasia, and we did Pharaoh on our own. We would get the covers printed at a place I was working at the time, a little print shop on Leatherette. And we'd get those printed. We would type up the texts on a Selectric typewriter in columns,
which seemed all uptown.
Yeah,
we had borrowed that Selectric because it was so cool.
And then to do like the right justify on the text, right? We would have to insert spaces in the individual lines and then retype it so the edges were even.
Man.
And then we would cut out those strips of paper and use rubber cement to glue them onto, forms,
layout
forms, and then insert the graph, the art, whatever art we happen to scrounge, and then photocopy those, bring them home, and on our card table in our kitchen, we would staple them and hand bind them. We did Rahasia that way. We did Pharaoh that way, and we're in the process of writing something called Vampire at the time. We called Vampire at the time. When desperation led us to send our modules to then TSR Incorporated, and
seems like that was a good call.
It was desperation at the time. I've been out of work for almost a year.
A year, a month, 2 months.
Oh, well, yeah. And we couldn't buy shoes for our children that winter. And so in an effort to raise that money, we sent these adventure modules into TSR, and they offered us a job instead. They said, yeah, we'll buy them, but we'll also offer you a job. And that's where we got our professional start in D&D. Drove across the country from Utah to Wisconsin and took a job at TSR. I can remember when I first saw Gary Gygax. I was in such awe. I was tongue-tied. I couldn't speak to him.
And then, so obviously from there, now part of TSR, there's a whole slew of things that came during that tenure as well.
Well, Vampire became Ravenloft. And Ravenloft is
just a small thing. Some people might have heard of that. A small
thing. It's you might have heard of it.
Sure.
One of the interesting things about these early modules is we called them night ventures, and they were meant to be played in 1 or 2 evenings worth of play.
Oh, okay.
And someone came across an article recently that they sent me that said Ravenloft looks like it was designed to be played in an evening or two. And I thought that was so funny because they didn't know the history, but it still was in there, even though the history had been lost to them.
Well, and the two things that we want to bring into it was accessibility, to be able to play it quickly. But for us, the more important part of that was to bring story into the adventure game.
Sure.
And prior to that time, adventure games, D&D games they were very much a kind of a go in, kill the monster, get the treasure.
A loose, overview of what it was, but not an actual story up front that you gave them.
And so our adventures all imbued story within it. They all contained a story motion within it and a story to discover as you went through it. And all of that then became very much central to Dragonlance when it came out.
I have a question. Why vampires? Why Ravenloft? What was the thought process behind that at the time?
Tracy was reading me Bram Stoker.
Well, that makes sense now.
Well, and I had also gone, a friend had run a dungeon, and I'd gone into this dungeon, and it was a pretty typical dungeon, mostly random encounter tables. And I remember, we'd meet a kobold, we'd meet an orc, okay, and we'd fight, okay, fine. We came around the corner and we met a vampire. And I remember thinking at the time, what are you doing here? I mean, you're just wandering around randomly here, running into people. This is so beneath you. It was somehow a vampire had hit Skid Row and was wandering around the dungeon with a cup, begging money for, cheap blood. I'm not sure, how that would work. But seeing him there really kind of galvanized me into thinking, and Laura and I both, since we've been exploring vampires, that a vampire needed a setting.
He needed a castle.
Yeah, right.
A kingdom.
And a reason to be here, and a story. And that's where Stradman Zarovich was born, and where Ravenloft came from. It's sometime we'll have to get together, by the way, and talk about Ravenloft.
I would love that. Yeah, I mean, and just goes to show you folks, just those random encounter tables that you think might not be, they could spawn a whole campaign setting. So don't discount them.
Yeah, absolutely can.
So you mentioned Dragonlance, which is obviously, again, from what I've seen from a lot of folks, their introduction in some instances to fantasy in general. And then I've also seen with a ton of people that they didn't even know that it was they just knew it as a fantasy novel. They didn't know that it was tied in any way to Dungeons and Dragons. And then obviously that's spawned, I don't even know how many books, but why don't we talk a little bit about Dragonlance?
Well, Dragonlance, of course, Dragonlance came from an unusual corporate place.
Okay.
Back in the 80s, it was really very much in vogue for companies to hire consultants. And the consultants would come in and analyze your business and tell you, about how to fine tune your business and make your business better. It was back in the 80s. That's what everybody did. So TSR was.
My watch says our front door's open. I've got to go look. I'm sorry.
No worries. Go ahead.
If there's anybody there, tell them go away. Okay.
Anyway.
I'm going to keep telling the story, though.
Sure.
Okay. So life intrudes. It just does.
Yeah.
So they had this company come in and analyze TSR, and they came back with a report, and I can still remember they gathered everybody together to read them the results of this report. And Penny, I think it was, that read it to us, and as we all listened with bated breath, she said, 1, Dungeons and Dragons is the core of your business. Well, surprise. Okay, fine. 2, you have lots of dungeons. Okay. 3, you don't have enough dragons. Wow.
Consultant, what a crack-on consultant that is, huh?
Yeah, I don't know what we paid for that, but it was probably an enormous amount of money. So, and so the cry, you know, the decree went out from on high. What have we got with dragons in it?
Mm-hmm.
And Doug Niles, I think, had one proposal, and I prepared another proposal based on something that Laura and I had come up with as we traveled across the country to take this job at TSR. We were, quite frankly, as we were driving across the great flatness of Kansas, we were wondering what we could bring to the company that would justify them actually paying us money
Sure.
to do what we love.
To write games.
To write
I
games.
can remember my darling father-in-law at the time saying, son, they don't pay people to write games. And yet we packed up and went to Wisconsin anyway.
So as we were driving across the country, we were trying to come up with something that would be of value to the company that they could actually, that would justify them paying us money to design games. And it was on that trip that Dragonlance was born. The title was born on that trip, and the basic idea was born on that trip. So as I was at the company and the call went out for dragons, then we took that idea, married it to the then, I think it was 12 dragons that were the pantheon at the time in the monster manual. But we didn't want to propose, of course, that it be, you know, dragon of the month.
Sure.
You know, kill a black dragon, take its stuff, kill a white dragon, take its stuff. And brought this broad epic scope story to D&D. It was interesting, the Dragonlance novels were the first novels, I believe, created specifically for a role-playing game line.
Wow.
And it wasn't long after that it became the standard, that storytelling in the game became the standard, and that having a novel associated with a game became more of a standard. It was great to pioneer that.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, it's true. You know, I mean, it seems to have kind of fallen off for the most part as of late in the current world that we're in. But there is a long lineage of just all sorts of bibliography for all of the different editions, and even for a variety of different stories. And it's great. It especially if you're looking to build out your world and you don't have access to, I mean, there's so many, you know, campaign guides and modules you can pull from, but a novel, you can just tell that story in a way that a campaign book can't. And it's definitely, I've seen it for various Ravenloft books and things that I've read, and just to really build out these worlds and allow you to learn so much about the people and the interactions. And it's just wild to think that this is where it all started.
Yeah, very much so. And yeah, it has, I think, dropped off in vogue in terms of like doing a novel to go with the game. But at the same time, you know, since then, we've seen this huge proliferation of media channels and social channels and streaming.
Sure.
Yeah, you know, and things like your show here.
Sure.
This gives us a lot more opportunity to explore world backgrounds in new ways than we had, say, you know, back in the 1980s.
Well, we've got a lot more creative latitude because of all the different outlets there are. It's like amazing. It's like, you want to do something, go do it.